For years, you've probably heard the same advice repeated like gospel. Avoid bread. Bread makes you bloated. Bread spikes your blood sugar. Bread causes inflammation. Bread is the enemy. And yet, this advice collapses the moment you step backward in time. In medieval Europe, bread was not a side dish. It was the foundation of life. For peasants, monks, soldiers, and even kings, bread supplied anywhere from 50 to 70% of daily calories. Entire civilizations were built on it. Wars were fought over grain supplies. Laws were written to regulate bread weight and quality. Bakeries were essential infrastructure, not lifestyle boutiques. And here's the uncomfortable paradox. Despite eating far more bread than we do today, medieval populations were not drowning in chronic digestive disease. They didn't have epidemics of IBS, gluten intolerance, or metabolic syndrome. Bread did not make them chronically inflamed, exhausted, or sick. So the problem clearly isn't bread itself. Something else changed. This story is not about nostalgia or romanticizing the past. It's about asking a dangerous question modern food culture doesn't like to confront. Why was medieval bread a nutritional cornerstone, while modern bread quietly sabotages your health? And once you start following the evidence, the answer leads somewhere deeply unsettling. Medieval people didn't eat bread occasionally. They ate it constantly. Breakfast was bread soaked in broth or ale. Lunch was bread with onions, cheese, or legumes. Dinner was bread again, often used as a plate itself. Thick slabs called trenchers that absorbed sauces and fats before being eaten or given to the poor. Bread wasn't empty calories, it was the diet, which raises the first crack in the modern narrative. If bread were inherently harmful, medieval societies should have collapsed under digestive illness long before modern medicine existed. They didn't. Instead, bread sustained hard physical labor, long fasting periods, and lives that demanded metabolic resilience. Something about that bread worked with the human body rather than against it. The obvious question follows. What the hell changed? Before we answer that, let's pause and turn the spotlight away from the consumer. Because modern food culture is quick to blame you, your genetics, your lifestyle, your lack of discipline. If bread hurts you, you're told it's because you're sensitive, intolerant, or doing something wrong. But medieval humans were not biologically different from us. Their digestive systems were not magically superior. Their intestines did not evolve some lost enzyme in the last 600 years. The variable is not the human body. The variable is the bread. And to understand that difference, we have to strip modern bread down to its bones. Walk into a supermarket today and pick up a loaf of mass-produced bread. Ignore the pastoral imagery on the packaging, the wheat fields, the smiling farmers, the words like artisan or natural. Turn the bag around. What you're holding is not bread in the historical sense. It's a tightly engineered industrial product designed around three priorities: speed, consistency, and shelf life. Modern bread is built to rise fast, bake fast, ship fast, and survive weeks without molding. To achieve this, the grain itself had to change. Medieval wheat was genetically diverse. Fields were planted with mixed land races, populations of wheat that varied naturally in protein structure, mineral content, and enzyme activity. These grains grew slowly, adapted to local soils, and produced gluten that was weaker, more elastic, and easier to digest. Modern wheat, by contrast, is aggressively standardized. Over the last century, especially after World War II, plant breeding focused on yield, uniformity, and mechanical compatibility. Wheat was selected not for human digestion, but for how well it performed in industrial systems: high gluten strength, predictable behavior, and maximum extractable flour. This is not a small shift. Gluten is not a single substance. It's a complex network of proteins. By intensifying certain protein fractions, modern wheat fundamentally altered how dough behaves and how your gut encounters it. But the grain is only the beginning. Now consider how medieval bread was made. There was no commercial yeast, No instant rise, no 90-minute bread cycle. Dough was fermented slowly using wild yeasts and bacteria, what we now call sourdough, though back then it was simply bread. Fermentation wasn't a trend. It was a necessity. And in that necessity lay a hidden advantage. Slow fermentation pre-digests the grain. It breaks down complex carbohydrates, neutralizes anti-nutrients like phytic acid, and partially dismantles gluten structures before the bread ever reaches your stomach. Minerals become more bioavailable. Blood sugar response becomes gentler. The bread becomes biologically cooperative. Modern bread skips this entirely. Industrial dough is forced to rise as fast as possible. Chemical dough conditioners, added enzymes, and aggressive yeast activity do in hours what fermentation once did in days, but without the same biochemical transformation. The result looks like bread, tastes like bread, but behaves very differently once inside your body. And this is where many people begin to feel something is off. If you've ever eaten bread and felt bloated, foggy, inflamed, or exhausted afterward, your body isn't malfunctioning. It's responding appropriately to a food that has been stripped of the processes that once made it digestible. Medieval bread wasn't designed to overpower biology. It evolved alongside it. Modern bread is designed to dominate a supply chain. This distinction matters more than nutrition labels will ever tell you, because the real issue is not carbs, calories, or even gluten in isolation. It's the relationship between food and time. Medieval bread respected time, time for grain to mature, time for dough to ferment, time for microbes to do their work. Modern bread treats time as an enemy, and every shortcut taken to save time extracts a biological cost somewhere downstream, usually in your gut, your metabolism, or your immune system. At this point, some people push back. They argue that medieval life was harsh, short, and disease-ridden. And that's true, for different reasons. Infant mortality was high. Infections were deadly. Injuries were often fatal. But chronic metabolic disease, widespread digestive dysfunction, systemic inflammation driven by daily food intake, those are modern phenomena. Which brings us to an uncomfortable realization. The diseases we associate with aging or modern stress may actually be symptoms of a food system that no longer produces food in the historical sense. Bread crossed that line earlier than most. What was once a fermented, mineral-rich, biologically active staple became a refined, accelerated, chemically assisted product, still called bread, but no longer playing the same role in the body. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. In the next part of this story, we'll use history itself as evidence, looking closely at ancient grains, agricultural diversity, and why medieval bread nourished people instead of inflaming them. Because before we talk about science, we need to understand what was lost. And the loss didn't begin in a laboratory. It began in the field. If medieval bread didn't make people sick, history itself becomes a form of evidence. Not anecdote, not nostalgia, but large-scale, long-term human data. For centuries, entire populations survived, often under extreme physical stress, on diets dominated by bread. That only works if the grain itself cooperates with human biology. And medieval grain was nothing like what fills modern fields today. To understand why, we need to leave the bakery and go back to the field. Medieval wheat was not a single thing. There was no universal wheat. Instead, there were dozens of local varieties, grown side by side. Einkorn, emmer, spelt, rivet wheat. Land races adapted to specific valleys, climates, and soils, each with different protein profiles, mineral content, and enzymatic behavior. This diversity mattered. Genetic diversity acts as a buffer. It prevents uniform weaknesses. It moderates extremes. When you eat diverse grains, you don't overwhelm your digestive system with one hyper-concentrated protein structure. You get variation, softer glutens, different starch ratios, slower digestion. Medieval farmers didn't select wheat for how tall it grew, how fast it ripened, or how well it tolerated chemical inputs. They selected it for survivability, flavor, and usability. Grain had to store well. It had to mill well. It had to bake well in wood-fired ovens. And most importantly, it had to sustain people through long winters and fasting seasons. The grain was part of an ecosystem, not a commodity. Modern wheat, on the other hand, is the result of extreme narrowing. Over the last century, especially during the push to industrialize agriculture, diversity was treated as inefficiency. Fields were standardized. Seeds were selected for uniform height, uniform ripening, and maximum yield per hectare. But uniform systems are fragile, and the human gut feels that fragility first. Then there is the matter of milling. Medieval flour was stone ground, slowly, coarsely, imperfectly. That imperfection was a feature, not a flaw. Stone milling preserves the germ and bran, the parts of the grain rich in minerals, fats, fiber, and micronutrients. It also preserves enzyme activity that helps break down starch during fermentation. Modern roller milling strips all of that away. White flour is produced by aggressively separating the starchy endosperm from everything else. The result is a powder that stores longer and behaves predictably in industrial processes, but one that is biologically incomplete. To compensate, synthetic vitamins are added back in. Iron filings, folic acid, isolated nutrients attempting to mimic a complex whole. But food is not a math equation. You cannot subtract biological complexity and then add back isolated components without consequences. Medieval bread delivered minerals in forms the body could absorb. Modern bread delivers calories first, and nutrition as an afterthought. Now let's talk about fermentation again, because this is where history becomes almost surgical in its precision. Medieval bread was alive before it was baked. Wild fermentation wasn't optional. Dough was kept from one bake to the next. Microbial cultures evolved within specific environments: bakeries, monasteries, villages. These cultures partially broke down gluten and starches, reduced phytic acid, and transformed the bread long before it entered the oven. This process did something remarkable. It outsourced digestion. By the time medieval bread reached the stomach, much of the hardest work had already been done by bacteria and time. Modern bread does none of this. Instead, the digestive burden is pushed entirely onto the human body. Your gut is expected to handle intact starches, aggressive gluten structures, residual enzyme activity, and chemical additives, all at once. When it struggles, the system labels you as defective. History suggests otherwise. Critics often argue that medieval people didn't live long enough to experience chronic disease. This argument sounds logical until you examine it closely. Yes, average life expectancy was lower, but largely due to infant mortality and infectious disease. Once someone reached adulthood, many lived into their 60s and beyond. Skeletal remains show arthritis, healed fractures, and physical wear, but not the widespread metabolic and inflammatory markers that dominate modern populations. More importantly, digestive disease does not require decades to appear. If bread were inherently harmful, symptoms would have emerged early and often, especially given how much of it people consumed. But the historical record does not support that. Instead, it shows something else entirely: adaptation through food processing. Bread was not merely eaten, it was prepared intelligently. Now we reach a critical turning point in the story. After World War II, everything changed. Agriculture was rebuilt using industrial logic. Chemicals developed for warfare were repurposed as fertilizers and herbicides. Mechanization demanded uniform crops. Bakeries scaled up to feed growing urban populations. Speed replaced patience. Yield replaced nourishment. And bread, once a slow, local, biologically tuned food, became a product optimized for profit and convenience. This wasn't evil. It was efficient. But efficiency has a cost. The human digestive system evolved to handle food that was fermented, diverse, and minimally refined. It did not evolve to process highly refined flour engineered for shelf stability and rapid expansion. And when biology meets industrial logic, biology always loses. Here's the uncomfortable truth history forces us to confront. The problem is not that humans can't handle bread anymore. The problem is that bread no longer behaves like food. It behaves like a substrate, designed to be manipulated, accelerated, and monetized. Medieval bread nourished people because it was part of a living system. Modern bread destabilizes people because it exists inside an industrial one. And once you understand that, the next question becomes unavoidable. If history shows us what worked, and industry shows us what changed, what does science say about what's happening inside your body right now? That's where this story goes next. Because the damage doesn't start with symptoms. It starts with chemistry. By the time bread reaches your plate today, the damage has already been done, long before digestion begins. To understand why modern bread feels so different in your body, we have to zoom in, past history, past agriculture, past tradition, down to chemistry and biology. This is where the story stops being philosophical and becomes unavoidable. Because your gut does not lie. Let's start with the word everyone loves to blame, gluten. Gluten is not a single villain. It's a network of proteins, primarily gliadin and glutenin, that give dough its elasticity and structure. In traditional grains and long fermented doughs, this network is weaker, more fragmented, and partially broken down before baking. In modern bread, gluten is stronger, denser, and more intact. Why? Because modern wheat breeding intentionally amplified gluten strength. Strong gluten means higher rise, better machine handling, and uniform texture at scale. It also means gluten structures that resist breakdown, both during fermentation and digestion. Your digestive system is now forced to confront protein networks that are more aggressive than anything humans encountered historically. This matters because partially digested gluten proteins can interact with the gut lining in ways that trigger immune responses, even in people without celiac disease. That's why so many people who aren't gluten intolerant still feel worse after eating bread. It's not intolerance. It's overload. Now layer fermentation back into the equation. Traditional fermentation doesn't just make bread taste better, it changes the molecular structure of the food. Beneficial bacteria and yeasts consume sugars, break down starches, and degrade problematic proteins. They also reduce phytic acid, a compound that binds minerals like iron, zinc, and magnesium, making them unavailable for absorption. Medieval bread delivered calories and minerals. Modern bread delivers calories first and blocks mineral absorption at the same time. This creates a quiet paradox. People can be overfed and undernourished simultaneously. You eat bread, feel full, yet your body keeps signaling hunger, not for calories, but for nutrients that never arrived. Then come the additives. Industrial bread is rarely just flour, water, salt, and yeast. It often contains emulsifiers, dough conditioners, preservatives, and enzymes designed to standardize texture and extend shelf life. Some of these compounds interfere directly with gut barrier function. Research increasingly links common bread emulsifiers to increased intestinal permeability, often referred to as leaky gut. When the gut barrier is compromised, particles that should remain inside the digestive tract pass into the bloodstream. The immune system reacts. Inflammation follows. Again, this isn't a personal failure. It's a predictable biological response to food engineered without regard for digestion. At this point, the system offers a convenient scapegoat. You. You're told you're sensitive, or aging, or stressed, or genetically unlucky. But controlled studies reveal something far more damning. When people switch from modern wheat to ancient varieties, or from industrial bread to long fermented sourdough, many experience rapid improvements in digestion, inflammation markers, and blood sugar regulation. Same calories, same carbs, different processing. The problem is not bread as a concept. The problem is how bread is made. Now, zoom out. After World War II, food production shifted from nourishment to optimization. Governments incentivized yield. Corporations prioritized shelf life. Bread became a delivery vehicle for cheap calories rather than a fermented staple embedded in local ecology. The consequences were not immediate. They unfolded slowly, over decades. Digestive discomfort became normal. Bloating became expected. Blood sugar instability became common. Autoimmune conditions rose quietly in the background. Bread didn't poison people overnight. It eroded resilience gradually. And the most dangerous part? The product kept the same name. Calling modern industrial bread bread is like calling ultra-processed cheese milk. The linguistic continuity hides a biological rupture. So where does that leave you? Not powerless, but responsible. You don't need to romanticize the Middle Ages or bake bread in a stone oven to reclaim some of what was lost. But you do need to recognize the difference between food and product. Here are the only solutions that history, science, and biology agree on. Choose bread made from ancient or diverse grains, not standardized high-yield wheat. Prioritize long fermentation, real sourdough, not sour-flavored bread. Accept less bread, but better bread, rather than unlimited refined loaves. Or step away from bread entirely and replace it with other whole grains prepared traditionally. The key is not restriction. It's respect for biological time. Medieval people didn't have nutrition labels. They didn't count macros. They didn't debate gluten on the internet. They inherited knowledge shaped by survival. They understood, implicitly, that food must be transformed before it transforms you. Modern society forgot that lesson. And now, many bodies are paying the price. Bread was once a superfood, not because it was simple, but because it was prepared with humility toward biology. Modern bread makes people sick, not because humans changed, but because food did. The choice is not between past and present. It's between real food and industrial approximation. Once you see that difference clearly, you don't need to be told what to eat. Your gut will tell you.